If you walked into a jewelry store in Miami in 1977, you would have witnessed something that puzzled even the wealthiest Americans. Families of 12 Venezuelans dressed in designer clothes, buying everything in sight. When they saw something they liked, they didn't ask the price. They said, "Dame Doss, give me 2. 1 for me, 1 for my brother." They paid in cash. Crisp $100 bills that smelled like bank vaults. The merchants called them the oil princes of the Caribbean. But here's what nobody understood at the time. These people weren't rich. They were living on borrowed money. The entire country was running on a credit card. And in exactly 6 years, that credit card would get declined. Venezuela didn't collapse because of socialism or corruption or bad luck. Venezuela collapsed because of a loan agreement signed in a Manhattan hotel room. This is the story of how American banks built a trap, how a nation walked into it willingly, and how the interest rate on that trap destroyed an entire generation. This is about the ledger, and the ledger never lies. Caracas in the mid-70s looked like a city from the future. Construction cranes lined the skyline like a steel forest. The Concorde landed twice a week, bringing European aristocrats to French restaurants that served Maine lobster. The streets were jammed with American muscle cars. Whiskey consumption per capita was the highest on earth. People drank 18-year-old scotch like it was water. The shops in Savannah Grande sold Italian fashion before it reached New York. This was the only South American city where you could fly from Paris in 3 hours on a supersonic jet. The Venezuelan bolivar was pegged at 4.30 to the dollar. It was rock solid. You could walk into any bank with bolivars and walk out with dollars. No questions asked. The middle class owned homes and cars. The government sent students to Harvard and Oxford for free, tens of thousands of them. Children of mechanics studying at the Sorbonne. It looked like a miracle. It looked like Venezuela had cracked the code of development. But miracles don't exist in economics. Only balance sheets exist. Beneath the champagne and the skyscrapers, Venezuela was bleeding. The country had stopped making things. Why would a farmer grow corn when he could import it from Iowa for half the price? Why would a factory make shoes when Italian leather was cheaper? A strong currency was a weapon pointed at the heart of domestic industry. Agriculture collapsed. The fields were abandoned. Farmers moved to shanty towns to live on government handouts. Venezuela imported everything. Eggs, clothes, cars, even the sand to build the concrete towers. The addiction to imports was the first part of the trap, but the real trap was invisible. It was written in the fine print of loan contracts signed in New York. Here's the paradox. Venezuela was swimming in oil money. So why did they need loans? The answer is simple. The banks needed to lend, and Venezuela was the perfect borrower. October 1973 changed everything. The Yom Kippur War erupted in the Middle East. Arab oil nations declared an embargo. The price of oil didn't just rise, it exploded. $3 a barrel became $12 overnight. It was the biggest transfer of wealth in human history. Money flooded into OPEC nations like a tidal wave. Venezuela was a founding member of OPEC. In fact, the entire organization was the brainchild of a Venezuelan named Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. He was a brilliant man who drove a small car and read by candlelight. He called oil the devil's excrement. He predicted it would bring waste and corruption. In 1974, nobody was listening to a grumpy old man. They were listening to cash registers ringing. The president was Carlos Andres Perez, known as Cap, charismatic, energetic, wearing loud plaid jackets. He took office just as the tsunami of petrodollars hit. He had too much money. The central bank couldn't store it. They stacked dollar sacks in ministry hallways. Cap declared Venezuela would become a first-world nation within a decade. He called it La Gran Venezuela, the Great Venezuela. The government launched massive projects. They nationalized the oil industry from Exxon and Shell. They built steel mills in the jungle to rival Pittsburgh. They built the Guri Dam, an engineering marvel. They built a subway system cleaner than New York's. They created scholarships for anyone who wanted to study abroad. It was audacious. It was noble. And it was built on quicksand. Here's what was happening behind the scenes. The oil money deposited in Venezuelan accounts ended up in American banks. Citibank, Chase Manhattan, Bank of America. These banks were drowning in cash from oil nations. But banks don't make money holding cash. They make money lending cash. The U.S. economy was in recession. American businesses weren't borrowing, so the bankers looked south. They saw Venezuela. Stable democracy. Massive oil reserves. The perfect customer. Bankers in expensive suits flew to Caracas on the Concorde. They stayed at luxury hotels drinking scotch. They met with ministers. They didn't wait for Venezuela to ask for money. They begged Venezuela to take it. The pitch was seductive. Oil prices will rise forever. Today it's $12 a barrel. Tomorrow it'll be $50. Borrow $1 billion today and inflation will erase the debt. It's free money. It's leverage. The Venezuelan government fell for it completely. They borrowed frantically. Billions to pay for projects running over budget. Billions to subsidize imports. Billions to cover corruption draining the treasury. The corruption was monumental. Government contracts went to friends. Ghost companies received loans never repaid. Every deal had a commission. The era of the 12 apostles began. 12 businessmen became billionaires by being close to the president. They built palaces and bought Caribbean islands. But the most dangerous part was hidden in the loan contracts. The bankers were smart. They used floating interest rates. This meant the rate wasn't fixed. It was tied to U.S. prime rates. If American rates went up, Venezuela's payments would skyrocket. Nobody in Caracas paid attention. In the mid-70s, USA rates were low. Money was cheap. The party continued. By the end of the 70s, Venezuela had the highest per capita debt in the world. They owed billions to the same banks holding their oil deposits. They were recycling their own money, paying interest to access their own wealth. It was a shell game of global proportions. The culture changed. Hard work evaporated. Easy money replaced it. If you needed a job, you joined the government. The bureaucracy swelled grotesquely. Elevator operators for automatic elevators. Gardeners for non-existent gardens. Consultants who never consulted. Everyone was on the payroll. The state became father, mother, and employer. But the illusion masked deep inequality. While the middle class flew to Miami, the poor watched from hillside slums. They got subsidies. Gasoline was cheaper than water. Fill a tank for the price of gum. Bread was artificially cheap. But schools crumbled and hospitals failed. Money went to concrete and imports, not people. The gap between country clubs and barrios grew wider daily. Warning signs were flashing red. The oil market was changing. North Sea and Alaska fields came online. OPEC's monopoly broke. Demand dropped as countries became energy efficient. Oil prices stopped rising. They wobbled. In 1979, President Luis Herrera Campins took office. In his inaugural address, he said something terrifying. "I'm inheriting a mortgaged country." He saw the books. He saw the debt. For every dollar coming in, 2 were going out. But he couldn't stop the machine. The political cost was too high. People were addicted to subsidies. The Dame Doss mentality was ingrained in the national psyche. Being rich felt natural. So instead of cutting back, they doubled down. They borrowed more to pay interest on old loans. Musical chairs with no end. But the music was about to stop. In Washington, D.C., Paul Volcker was appointed Federal Reserve Chairman. A giant of a man with a cigar and a mission: kill inflation in America. To do that, he would raise interest rates to levels never seen before. He would destroy Venezuela's dream. The year is 1981. The trap snaps shut. Volcker raises U.S. interest rates to 20%. Shock therapy for America. A death sentence for Venezuela. Remember those floating rates in the loan contracts? Overnight, interest payments on Venezuela's debt doubled, then tripled. They'd borrowed when money cost 5%. Now they serviced debt at 20%. At the exact same time, the oil market collapsed. A glut drove prices down. The perfect storm arrived. Expenses skyrocketed while income plummeted. The vice tightened. For a few years, the government hid reality. They burned through reserves, propping up the currency. They kept the Bolivar pegged at 4.30. They wanted to maintain the Saudi-Venezuela illusion. They wanted Miami flights to continue. But you cannot fight mathematics. The central bank was bleeding dollars. Every day, millions left the country. Nervous investors and wealthy Venezuelans moved money to Swiss accounts. Capital flight on an industrial scale. The 12 apostles who'd benefited most abandoned ship first, taking billions with them. Then came the day of reckoning. Friday, February 18th, 1983. A date burned into every Venezuelan's memory. Viernes Negro, Black Friday. That morning, the government admitted defeat. They could no longer defend the currency. The Bolivar was devalued. The exchange rate of 4.30 vanished instantly. The government created multiple exchange rates. But the reality was brutal. The currency crashed. Imagine waking up with your savings worth half. Imagine owing money in dollars and your debt tripling overnight. Imagine being a student in London when your scholarship check stops coming. Your credit card stops working. You're evicted from your apartment. The psychological shock was immense. The Dame Doss Erie ended that morning. Concorde flights were canceled. Miami shopping sprees stopped. The middle class felt rich and invincible yesterday. Today they felt poor and vulnerable. The party was over. The lights turned on. The room was full of broken glass and unpaid bills. The hangover had begun, but the financial crash was just the beginning. The 80s became Latin America's lost decade. For Venezuela, it was a slow slide into poverty. The government was bankrupt. They couldn't borrow any more because banks knew they couldn't pay. In fact, banks were now the enemy. Here's the twist. The same American banks that forced loans in the 70s now demanded money back with ruthless aggression. They sent lawyers and accountants to Caracas. They demanded the government cut social spending, remove subsidies, sell state assets. They didn't care about Venezuelan suffering. They only cared about their balance sheets. Smiling bankers with briefcases became grim auditors with calculators. Venezuela tried to negotiate. They refinanced the debt repeatedly. But every refinancing came with conditions, and every condition meant more pain for citizens. Infrastructure built during the boom began rotting. Roads developed car-swallowing potholes. Hospitals ran out of medicine. Equipment broke down. Schools fell into disrepair. La Grande Venezuela was crumbling before people's eyes. By 1988, desperation reigned. Carlos Andrés Pérez decided to run for president again. He campaigned on nostalgia. Remember the good times? He promised to bring back abundance. He danced on stages and waved his arms. Desperate people believed him. They voted him back in a landslide. They thought simply having him in the palace would raise oil prices. They thought he had a magic wand. But when Cap took office in 1989, the cupboard was bare. International reserves were effectively zero. He had no choice. He turned to the lender of last resort, the International Monetary Fund. The IMF offered a bailout, $4.5 billion to stabilize the economy. But the IMF isn't charity. They demanded a strict structural adjustment program called El Gran Virage, the Great Turn. The package required lifting price controls, privatizing state companies, and most explosively removing the gasoline subsidy. For Venezuelans, cheap gasoline was a birthright, the one tangible benefit of being oil-rich. Raising gas prices was taboo, the third rail of Venezuelan politics. But Cap, trapped by debt and bankers, agreed to the terms. He announced the package on television. Sacrifices are necessary for the future. On February 27, 1989, new prices went into effect. Gasoline prices rose, public transportation costs followed. Bus drivers raised fares. People in commuter towns woke up for work. They couldn't afford the bus ride. It started as a small protest in Caracas. People shouted. They burned tires. Then, like a spark in gasoline, anger exploded. The protests spread to Caracas. People descended from the ranchos into the city center. But this wasn't a political march. It was a riot known as the Caracazo. For 3 days, Caracas burned. People looted supermarkets, electronic stores, shopping malls. They were taking back what was stolen. They looted symbols of the Saudi era they could no longer afford. They carried beef and televisions on their backs. It was rage from a population promised paradise and given purgatory. The government panicked. Police were overwhelmed. Carlos Andrés Pérez, once the people's hero, suspended constitutional rights. He sent the army into streets. He gave the order to shoot. The repression was brutal. Soldiers with automatic weapons fired into crowds. They fired into shanty towns, indiscriminately. The official death toll was 300. Human rights groups estimate thousands died. Bodies were buried in mass graves. The Caracazo broke the bond between people and democracy. It destroyed the legitimacy of traditional parties. It destroyed the myth of Venezuelan exceptionalism. The illusion of the 70s led directly to the massacre of the 80s. The wealth had been a trap. By borrowing against the future, Venezuela mortgaged its stability. The U.S. banking system profited on the way up. Massive fees for arranging loans and holding deposits. They profited on the way down, getting bailed out by IMF packages that squeezed Venezuelans to pay interest. The psychological scar cannot be overstated. It created deep resentment against the United States and capitalism. People felt tricked. They felt their nation's wealth was looted by foreign bankers and corrupt elites. They looked at rusting skeletons of unfinished projects, monuments to theft. They looked at politicians and saw liars. In this environment of ruin and anger, a young military officer named Hugo Chavez saw his opening. 3 years after the Caracazo, in 1992, he launched a coup attempt. He failed militarily, but succeeded politically. He told people the system was rotten. The oil wealth belonged to them. He tapped into nostalgia for lost wealth and anger at betrayal. When he spoke, he wasn't just speaking politics. He was speaking about the broken promise of the Saudi era. Let that sink in. The entire political destiny of Venezuela for the next 30 years was written in those loan contracts signed in Manhattan hotel rooms. The Saudi era proved that money is not wealth. Wealth is productivity. Wealth is education. Wealth is institutions. Venezuela had money but not institutions to manage it. It suffered the resource curse in its most acute form. Oil made the state autonomous from society. The government didn't need taxes from people, so it didn't listen to people. It only needed to please international oil markets and international bankers. When oil markets turned and bankers turned, the state collapsed. The tragedy of the Dame Doss generation is they thought they were investing in a modern country. They were just spending their inheritance on a party. They woke up with a hangover that's lasted 40 years. Today, if you visit Caracas, you can still see remnants of that era. Futuristic architecture from the 70s now stained and crumbling. Skeletons of unfinished buildings standing like tombstones. And in the minds of the older generation, you can find memory of when the Concorde landed and the Venezuelan Bolivar was the envy of the world. But it's a bitter memory, because they know now the wealth wasn't real. It was a loan taken against their children's future, and the payments on that loan are still being made today. In poverty, in migration, in the destruction of a nation that once dreamed of being La Gran Venezuela. The banks got their money back. The politicians got their kickbacks. But the people got the bill, and the bill was everything they had. This is the lesson that history teaches. Sovereignty is solvency. The moment you can't pay your debts, you lose control of your destiny. The bankers become your government. The IMF becomes your parliament. And your people become collateral damage in a financial transaction. Venezuela's collapse wasn't a political accident. It was a foreclosure. Think about the scale of that. An entire nation liquidated because of floating interest rates in loan contracts. The story of Saudi Venezuela is the story of Icarus, flying too close to the sun on wings made of oil and borrowed dollars, only to fall crashing into the sea. If this documentary opened your eyes to how economics shapes history, subscribe now, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming. The next collapse is always being built today, and only those who understand the ledger will see it before it happens.